talk to you guys about causal inference methods and, well, frankly, actually what even causal inference means. Just to recap quickly before we start, last time I did a presentation, I talked a little bit about Mendelian randomization and how Mendelian randomization is one way that you can try and assess causality in your data. And these causal inference methods I'm going to talk to you about today is another way of trying to assess causality with the data you have. I should also say that causal inference methods are super flexible and they're really cool. But because of their flexibility, I'm not going to be able to tell you exactly how to do causal inference methods because you have to apply them for the specific case that you're looking at. And so it's not just basically a recipe that I can give you, but I'm just going to try and give you a flavor for some of the different questions that can be asked and can be answered using causal inference methodology. Okay, so the first thing is, what does causal inference even mean? Like, I didn't really understand that when I started. And essentially, what causal inference methods are trying to do is to infer whether an association that you see is causal or not. Okay, so if you think about it, when you guys are in clinic and a patient comes to you and they have high blood pressure, you think, oh, how do I treat this patient? You can either treat them with lifestyle changes, telling them to, I don't know, exercise and eat well or whatever, or you can give them medication. And which one of these is better to do, right? And can you even answer that question? Because you have one patient in front of you and you can only treat that patient in one way. You can either assign them to a lifestyle intervention, or you can assign them to medication. And this is where causal inference methods come in, right? Because essentially, you're going to start thinking about potential outcomes and counterfactual approaches. So when that patient comes in front of you, you have to think about two different worlds or universes, essentially, where these two different universes are identical up until the patient presents in front of you. And in in universe A, you're treating that patient with lifestyle changes. And in universe B, you're treating that patient with medication. And everything else about these universes up until that time and going forward are going to be identical, except for the fact that in one, the patient has been assigned lifestyle changes, and in the other, the patient's been assigned medication. So any difference in these two universes could be attributed to the difference in the treatment you've given to that patient, yeah? So that's what causal inference methods are really all about. It's about trying to assess the difference in the high blood pressure of your patient that would be observed if they took medication versus if they had a lifestyle change, yeah? Because in reality, like I said, you can only observe one, but you're basically going to use your data to build this counterfactual universe that's identical to the one that's observed, except for the treatment that you've given. Does that make sense? Does everyone understand that? Yeah? Okay, cool. If anyone doesn't understand, just ask me, yeah? Perfect. Oh yes, now, so causal inference methods, they're ideal for observational data. Because when you have observational data, you can't like, sorry, my computer's going a bit weird. Here we go. Right. Yeah, the causal inference methods are ideal for observational data because when you have observational data, you can't randomize your data. You can't randomize people to, a lifestyle intervention or to treatment or whatever. But you can apply this counterfactual thinking. And something that I don't think a lot of people appreciate about causal inference methods is that the assumptions that are used that underline causal inference methodology, they're much less stringent than the traditional statistical approaches that are being used. And I think that's really valuable, but underappreciated. And like I said at the beginning, these approaches are super flexible and they can address a multitude of complex situations that, reflect the reality of real life. So they can deal with time-varying confounding, they can deal with confounders between mediators and outcomes, they can deal with multiple mediators. So they're super, super, super flexible. So here's an example of one of the first causal inference papers that I worked on, where I was interested in how obesity over your adult life affects physical functioning at older ages. Okay, so I was interested in this obesity trajectory affecting physical functioning. But your obesity trajectory doesn't happen in isolation. Okay, things affect your obesity trajectory, and your obesity status affect things. Yeah, so a classic example would be physical activity. Yeah, so there's a bidirectional relationship between obesity and physical activity. So for example, if you're physically inactive at time A, you're more likely to be obese at time E. And if you're obese at time A, you're more likely to be physically inactive at time B, which means then you're more likely to be obese at time B, and so forth. So there's this bidirectional relationship happening between obesity and physical activity across your life. And both obesity and physical activity affect your physical functioning. And then you also have confounders, and these confounders kind of come up from across your life as well. So for example, your social class at birth can affect your obesity, your physical activity, and your physical functioning. There should be an arrow between social class and physical activity here. Yeah. And then you can also have things that change across your adult life that are confounders. So for example, smoking is a classic example. Your smoking status can change as you age. Yeah, and your smoking status will then affect your obesity trajectory, and your smoking status will could potentially affect your subsequent physical functioning. So I know I said that this is, I wrote the word simplified up here, and this diagram actually is simplified, but when you start breaking it down, you realize that like there are these kind of complex relationships that reflect real life that need to be considered. And all of these things that I've just talked about can be considered in a causal inference counterfactual modeling approach. So in this paper, what we did was, our counterfactual approach was, we said, okay, so we have these obesity trajectories, and what if we were able to make all people who were obese as active as all the people who were non-obese? Yeah, would the effect of obesity on physical functioning change? And that's quite a powerful question to ask, because just by asking that question, you can then decide whether it's worth investing in an intervention for obese people to make them physically active. Yeah, because what is the point of sorry, do you have a question? Okay, if you do, you can just ask, it's fine. Yeah, so what was I saying? Yeah, so essentially, it's quite a powerful kind of way of thinking, because you're asking right at the get-go, is it worth making this intervention to make obese people active? Yeah, before you even design the intervention, before you even do a trial, you're asking whether it's worth doing. And I think that that's really useful in settings where you don't have all the money in the world and you need to know where to invest for interventions. So that's an example, one example of where you can use causal inference methods. And here I've used this kind of simplified life course kind of pathway diagram to illustrate causal inference thinking, because I quite like this way of drawing, to be honest. But when you actually start doing causal inference methods, you're going to come across something called DAGs. And DAGs is short for directed acyclic graphs, and they're really, really powerful diagrams, okay? And these diagrams, I'm going to give you a couple examples of them on the next couple of slides. And these diagrams, what they do is they join different variables with arrows. And essentially, the arrow is going to indicate where you think that there's a cause and an effect, okay? And in your DAG, what's more important than the arrows between variables is where there is no arrow between a variable. Because when you don't have an arrow between variables, that means you're absolutely sure that there's no cause and effect relationship between these two variables. And so generally, the general advice is, if you're not sure if there's a causal effect between two variables, put an arrow in. Because if you put an arrow in, you can actually estimate it to be 0. Yeah, but if you don't put an arrow in, you're saying you're absolutely certain, beyond a shadow of a doubt, there's no relationship between the two variables, okay? And the great thing about DAGs is that you draw them, okay? You're drawing your relationships between variables, But behind this diagram, yeah, there's going to be an analytical strategy that helps you provide a method to estimate your effects of interest. And essentially, you're doing that without even writing a single formula. You're devising an analytical strategy from a diagram rather than from formulas. And I think that that's amazing. So here's an example of a DAG that we use to examine complicated relationships between early life disadvantage and frailty. And I think Joe's on this call as well. And Joe was a co-author on this paper. So any questions about it, you can ask her later, okay? But essentially, we were interested in how does early life SEP affect frailty in adulthood at 50. And we thought, well, okay, you can have this direct effect of early life SEP to frailty, yeah? Or you can have this effect of early life SEP and that continues into disadvantage in adulthood, which then affects frailty. So
Snehal, what's SEP?
Oh, sorry, socioeconomic position.
All right, thank you.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry. I should have explained that. It's disadvantage, yeah? So your early life disadvantage can affect frailty through continuities and disadvantage into adulthood, or you could have a direct effect, yeah? And then you can have things like confounders. So for example, sex could affect your frailty, and sex in some, social and cultural instances can affect your early life disadvantage as well. But this is actually a little bit of a simplification, because things like your adult smoking status, your physical activity, whether you have drinking problems, they can affect your adult disadvantage, and they can also affect your adult frailty status, yeah? So you need to account for that. But then also on top of that, your early life disadvantage can affect your adult behaviors, okay? And so here's a nice little DAG that we drew, yeah, where we wanted to estimate the effect of early life socioeconomic disadvantage on frailty. And we wanted to see how much of it was going through adult continuities in disadvantage into adulthood, and how much was actually remaining and going through other parts outside of adult disadvantage. And again, once we drew this DAG, we were like, okay, this is the relationships we wanted to model. We can now apply this kind of diagram, and we can use some counterfactual thinking and causal inference approaches to model these relationships of interest. Yeah. And here's another example of where we use DAGs to outline complicated relationships. So something I've been thinking about more recently is how socioeconomic disadvantage in childhood affects adult lung function, because your lungs develop when you're a child, and having disadvantage in childhood could mean that you live in less ventilated and more overcrowded places, and that affects your lung development, which then affects your maximum lung capacity when you become an adult, yeah? So this is my relationship of interest that I'm going to model. And you can have confounders of this relationship, like your sex, for example. But this isn't, real life is much more complicated than this, right? And you can have all these things in adulthood that are affected by your socioeconomic disadvantage and can affect your lung function. So for example, just like in the previous slide, you can have continuities in disadvantage. You can have your socioeconomic disadvantage in childhood affecting your behaviors, like your physical activity, your smoking, your diet patterns. They can affect your obesity and your inflammation and so forth. And all these things can affect your adult lung function. And again, all these things that are happening in adulthood can affect each other. Yeah. So you can be disadvantaged in adulthood, which means that you have poor health behaviors, which can then affect your obesity and then affect your inflammation. Or for example, something like smoking, it can affect your inflammation either through obesity or directly. And that's what all these different orange arrows are trying to indicate. You can have direct effects of obesity, of health behaviors on inflammation, or the effect of your health behavior through obesity onto inflammation. Yeah. And then don't forget, you can have confounders in adulthood. So for example, your mental health can affect your health behaviors and your adult disadvantage, and can also potentially affect your outcome. Yeah, and these adult confounders can be affected by both your sex at baseline, your baseline confounders, as well as your exposure, your socioeconomic disadvantage at baseline. And I completely appreciate you guys that this diagram looks super complicated. Okay, I'm not expecting anyone to be able to sit down for 2 minutes and draw a diagram like this, okay? This diagram actually takes the best part of a day to draw. And even then, you like draw it and you go away, and then you come back and you're like, no, actually, I think this is how the variables are related and so forth. And you keep adjusting it, yeah? But by drawing this diagram, you can take that diagram that you've drawn and shown it to someone who works in causal inference, yeah? And just by drawing that diagram, you've actually detailed some underlying assumptions for an analytical strategy. And it's amazing that you've done this, because you've done this without using a single formula. I don't know if I'm getting this message across to you, that like DAGs are super cool because you can get to really complex statistical methods by just a diagram without even writing a single formula down. And this is the basis, this is the start of most causal inference work. Okay. Also, I just wanted to put this one up here because I thought it was quite funny. DAGs can be useful in identifying selection bias and explaining Daily Mail headlines. Okay, so at the start of the pandemic, there was quite a lot of discussion about how smoking was protective from death from coronavirus, which is very counterintuitive. And you just were like, what? That makes no sense. What's going on? But then when you start reading about how and why they found smoking was protective against coronavirus, you realize that at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, they were just looking at people who were in hospitals for COVID, yeah? Because that was the only data that we had at the time. So essentially, you're looking at people who are in hospital for COVID-19, okay? Now, you're going to be in hospital for COVID-19 if, for example, you're frail and you're older, you're more likely to be hospitalized. Or if you're a smoker and you're not frail and so you're potentially younger, you're more likely to be hospitalized, yeah? So by conditioning on the people who are hospitalized for COVID-19, you're creating this really weird and spurious relationship between things like frailty and smoking. Because you're going to be in the hospital for COVID-19, which means you're frail. And if you're frail and older, you're less likely to be a smoker. Or you're in the hospital for COVID-19 and you're a smoker, and which means you're less likely to be frail and older. So then obviously you're going to find a bizarre relationship that smoking is protective against death from COVID-19 among people who are hospitalized, because the smokers are going to be younger and less frail than the other people in the hospital who are there for COVID-19. Yeah, I mean, a very similar argument can be made, an analogy can be made when you look at college admissions in America. Yeah, so you go to, especially for scholarships. So you tend to get a scholarship to colleges in America if either you're super clever or you're super athletic. Yeah, so in the general population, there's no relationship between IQ and athleticism. But in the subsample of people who have gotten scholarships to American universities, yeah, if you're super clever, you're not going to be super athletic. Or if you're super athletic, you're not going to be super clever. So you have created, there's this spurious relationship that is there in a subset of the population that doesn't reflect the general population. So when they found that smoking was protective for death from COVID-19, that was because they had selected on the people who were hospitalized for COVID-19. So this DAG here explains that, yeah? Because you have smoking and frailty that mean causing you to be in the hospital. And once you do that, there's some rules of DAG, which I'm not going to get into, means that you're going to have this spurious relationship between smoking and frailty. If you have one, you're less likely to have the other. And so I know that I haven't really talked about how to do causal inference at all, because I think it's too much to talk about in like, say, half an hour. But essentially, causal inference approaches can be done in 3 steps. And the first step, and this is the most important step, is about defining your question. Yeah, And you define your question by drawing your diagram, and you make your diagram as detailed and as complete as possible. And that helps you define what you want to estimate. Then once you have your diagram and you have a really solid, what is your question? Then you go and you speak to a statistician and you discuss, well, how will we identify these effects? How will I identify all these different effects that I want to estimate? And only after you do that, as your last step, then you crack open your data and estimate your effects. And I think this kind of three-step approach is actually important, not just for causal inference, but beyond. Because, for example, I do a lot of stat support for the division, and a lot of times people come to the stat support and they say, I have this data and I want to do a t-test. And I'm like, no, let's back up, right? It's first, what is the question that you're interested in asking? What do you want to find out? Yeah. That is always the first thing that you need to come with. The data that you have is like, your last step. You don't get overwhelmed with the data. You only open the data once you know what you're going to do. And I can't emphasize that enough. This is like your key slide, okay, guys? I have to end again with the bigger picture about causal inference and emphasize that there are many different methods to try and get at causality in, epidemiology. And causal inference methods are one of several tools to help you understand causal links between your exposures and outcomes. And there are other tools as well, like randomized controlled trials, systematic reviews, Mendelian randomization that we talked about last time. And it's trying to answer the same question using these different approaches that have different strengths and limitations, which is how you get to understanding causality with these big data sets. And here are some useful resources as well about causal inference. So DAGT is a website that will help you draw some DAGs that I showed you earlier. I personally don't really use it very much, but I think Tom is on this call and Tom uses DAGT often, so we can ask him questions about that later. I found this nice little conceptual summary for clinicians about causal inference, which I think is quite useful to read. I even found you guys a cartoon guide on causal inference, which was quite entertaining. But also, if you all are super into causal inference and you want to get a good handle on these methods, there's a free book with, importantly, sample data and code that you can use that's available from Harvard by a group which do some really good work there. And yeah, that's all that I wanted to say about it. I appreciate again that this is a really quick tour, but if you have any questions, I'm happy to discuss them with you now.